The Presidential Recordings is a new compilation of tapes and transcripts from the first 3 months of Lyndon Johnson's presidency. Next, hear clips and learn the context at this talk from the LBJ Presidential Library and Museum in Austin, Texas. It's an hour 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mason. The last introduction, that effusive that I had, was by Larry Temple on the occasion of my retirement, and I told the audience that I had written it. I don't think I can say the same thing for you, but I do thank you very much indeed. Publication of the 3 volumes that you see on the table up here tonight represent a significant day in the life of the LBJ Library. An important resource in the library's collections is now in the process of being made fully accessible for and to scholarship. That resource is, of course, the many hours of President Johnson's telephone conversations which were recorded during his administration. The library has been systematically reviewing and opening that material, and it's a very, very laborious process for the past 12 years. 80% of that material is now open, and work continues on the remainder. As a federal archival depository, the library makes available the original material in its holdings. It does not itself originate material. So to keep as far as possible from coloring the subject, the library does not attempt to make transcripts of the material, of the tapes. And that, under less than expert hands, that kind of coloration can take place. There were transcripts occasionally made in the White House by President Johnson's secretaries. And one transcript in particular confused the archivists in the library when they found it. It had President Johnson telling the person on the other end of the telephone conversation that he would have to cut off because he had a pack of bastards waiting for him, waiting to see him. A careful listening to the tape showed that what he said was he had the pack ambassador waiting for him. So if the transcripts are to serve history, they have to be scrupulously accurate. And that kind of transcribing, as laborious, and it is as laborious and as critical as the processing of the tapes themselves, and that kind of transcribing is being taken over by the Miller Center. The Miller Center is devoted to the study of the modern presidency in the University of Virginia, and it has, as these volumes demonstrate, taken on that very substantial and important task. As part of a larger project, the Center plans to transcribe every one of LBJ's conversations. The director of the Presidential Recordings Program and one of the general editors of the series in discussion tonight is Timothy Naftali. I'm pleased to introduce him to you, Mr. Naftali.
Well, thank you, Harry. You really can't retire. You've got a lot to read. It's a privilege for us from the University of Virginia's Miller Center of Public Affairs to be able to launch our LBJ publication series in your company and that of the Johnson family and the Johnson community of friends. In doing our work, we are ever mindful that Lyndon Baines Johnson was a husband and a father, as well as a president. And the Johnson family's decision to open this treasure trove must not have been easy, given that hearing the voice of a departed loved one is not easy. Therefore, we scholars can never adequately express our gratitude to you, Harry, and the Johnson family for these historical materials. I'd also like to try to thank Betty Sue Flowers and the LBJ Library and the LBJ Foundation and the National Archives for making us feel so at home here in Austin. We at the Presidential Recordings Program are a relatively small team with big ambitions. We envision that it will take 30 volumes to capture all of President Johnson's telephone and meeting recordings. As I said, Harry, you will have a lot of reading to do. When we began this project, we relied almost exclusively on the generosity of Thomas Jefferson's fans in Albemarle County, Virginia. As we broaden our work on LBJ, we are building a national community of supporters who are dedicated to seeing that Johnson's recordings are accessible in transcribed, annotated, and digital forms for the benefit of new generations. Let me introduce the LBJ editors who worked so hard on the volumes we're celebrating tonight. There are also two editors who are not volume editors but made a substantial contribution who are in the audience, and I would like to recognize both Pat Dunn, our assistant editor, and also Ashley High, our associate editor, for having done so much to make these volumes possible. There's a fourth editor, Max Holland, who unfortunately could not attend and be with us tonight. Well, the three scholars in front of you are very talented men. Kent Germany, and he's the first you'll hear from, is the chief of the LBJ project. A graduate of Tulane and an assistant professor at the University of Virginia, Kent is completing a new book entitled The End of Dixie, A History of Liberalism and Southern Culture, 1964 to 1974. Besides being the proud father of three girls, Kent finds time to guest host For the Record, a PBS public affairs talk show. But Kent wanted me to make clear to all of you that he spent the 5 most formative years of his childhood living in rural East Texas. Always a Texan. David Shreve is both the second volume editor and the second Louisianan here with us tonight. An LSU grad in U.S. economic history and also an assistant professor at the Miller Center, David has worked on both our Kennedy and Johnson books. Having spent 3 years as a budget analyst in the Louisiana House of Representatives, David understands very well creative accounting and has seen firsthand how skilled legislators can fund their own pet projects. His forthcoming book is on the genius of a great legislator who is dear to all of our hearts and who managed to get his national programs funded. That book will be LBJ and the Promise of American Life, the Political Economy of the Great Society. Robert David Johnson, whom we know as KC, was my classmate at Harvard, where he earned his PhD in 1993. KC is a professor of history at Brooklyn College and currently is a visiting professor at Harvard. Once at Harvard, well, whatever. A prolific writer, KC has written, among other books, the celebrated The Peace Progressives and American Foreign Relations. His new book, Congress and the Cold War, will be out in December. KC has no Southern or Texas ties other than his admiration for Lyndon B. Johnson. And frankly, that should be good enough. Before my colleagues play some marvelous selections from the tapes tonight, by the way, you know that we're celebrating two people tonight. We're celebrating Harry, but we're also going to celebrate President Johnson. And I think he'll like the fact that you'll hear more from him than from anybody else tonight. But before we move on to the selections from the tapes, I'd like to ask Harry to tell us something of how it is that this bounty came to be made available to all of us. Thank you.
Well, I think this story is known to a good many people here in the auditorium, but I'll be glad to go over it. Soon after President Johnson died, a woman who had worked for him in a confidential capacity for many years, Mildred Stegall, she may be here tonight. Mildred, are you here? One of the great figures out of the Johnson years. She came to me and said that she had in her possession 7 record center cartons containing belts of conversations, recorded conversations that had been secretly made in the White House by President Johnson. They had been left to her, she said, they'd been given to her by President Johnson with instructions that if they were still in her possession at the time he died, she should turn them over to me with instructions that they be kept closed for a period of 50 years after his death. I accepted them on that basis, and we immediately began to go about the task of making sure that they were preserved. We opened the boxes and found that they were dicta belts that were all crammed together, and rather than run the risk of having those belts turned to dust in the 50 years, we reboxed them and so that they would be preserved. I began, however, to get the idea that I really wanted to open those tapes. I didn't know what was in them. I did not know they existed. Some of my colleagues did know that tapes had been made, but I did not know that. And I certainly did not know what was in them. But I was certain that they were going to be important historical materials, and it seemed to me that they would be far better to serve history if they were open now than 50 years after the president's death. I didn't immediately act on it, but I began to take some steps, and so I consulted a couple of lawyers. One was Larry Temple here, and another was the counsel for National Archives, to make sure that I was not, if I decided to go ahead and open them, that I would not be violating any law. And the answer was from both that there was no reason to think that there would be any violation of the law. And so the next step was to talk to Lady Bird Johnson. She had no responsibility for them at all. The president did not leave them to her. She was not in the loop. He had left everything that he had left, he left directly to the government. But I thought there was a possibility that there would be some flack from this. I thought it was most likely that there would be some adverse reaction. And if there was, I really wanted her to be on my side. And I decided that if she did not acquiesce, I wouldn't do it. But I had the marvelous opportunity of talking to her about it in Acapulco. One of the great perks of the job, Betty Sue, I'm sorry you're not going to get it because she's too old now, but was to spend a week with her, my wife and I did, a week with her every winter in Acapulco. And Mrs. Johnson had this, and probably still does, this feeling that she has to actually work for every bit of pleasure she has. She can't really enjoy anything unless she feels that she has earned it by a little bit of work. So I decided I would give her some work, and on one occasion told her about these tapes. She did not know about them. She had no idea that they existed. She didn't know what was in them. But I told her all about it. I briefed her on the whole thing, and I told her I really wanted to open them, in spite of the president's instructions, presumably from the grave, that they should be kept closed. And I told her why, and she has a marvelous sense of history herself, and she could understand that they were going to be important historical materials, and she could see why it would be better to open them now than to wait. That isn't to say that she found it easy, because she was aware of the fact that her husband had given these instructions. Nonetheless, she said, and I want to tell you, I think she is one of the gutsiest ladies I've ever known in a good many ways. And knowing all the risks that might be involved, she said she would support whatever decision I made. And so it was easy from that time on to make the decision. And consequently, that is the beginning of it. It was made somewhat easier in a sense, because right after that, the Congress mandated that every archival depository that had anything at all relating to the Kennedy assassination should open that material, no matter how classified it was. And so we made the decision here, without having listened to any of the tapes, we made the decision that everything that first month was going to relate in some way or other to the Kennedy assassination. So we opened all of that material first, and then from there on it was relatively simple, once the decision's been made, to begin to open the rest of it. So that is the story. I'm very pleased that we did it. I think it, I do look back on it as one of probably the thing that I'm proudest of in the 30 years that I was director of the library. But I also want to say that every time I even think of taking a bow for it, I take half a bow and I reserve the other half for Lady Bird Johnson. Thank you. Oh, and now it is my pleasure to begin the operation that will show some of the tapes, and I think we begin with Kent, Germany. Some of the heaviest moments in American history are those that surrounded the death of President John Kennedy, and Mr. Germany has the recording of how that traumatic moment was transmitted to Kennedy's staff.
Thank you, Director Middleton, and I certainly want to echo the thanks that everyone's given you today, and certainly to the Johnson family, because if it weren't for you, I may be unemployed. And as Johnson said, you know, people shouldn't live off the dole, so I guess I'm living off the Johnson dole at some level. Unfortunately, Max Holland could not be here tonight. We were fortunate enough to have Max as the editor of Volume 1 of this 3-volume series. Max has a very deep knowledge about the assassination. I believe he came and gave a talk here at the LBJ Library. So I don't want you to confuse me. I'm not Max. I'm Kent, but I'm going to fill in and play a clip that comes from his volume. And the volume that Max worked on essentially doesn't start with the assassination of John Kennedy, but it starts with a couple of airplanes that were in the air and bouncing around the country. And one of those planes was carrying just about half of the cabinet. It was about 2 hours west of Honolulu when they got some transmissions that something funny had happened in Dallas, and some reports that President Kennedy had been shot. And what I want to play here is a clip of how the President's press secretary and how the Secretary of State were receiving information about events on the ground in Dallas. This first clip is about they're receiving word that President Kennedy had been shot.
Situation room, this is Wayside. You read me, over? This is the Situation Room. I read you. Go ahead. Give me all available information on President, over. All available information on President follows. He and Governor Connolly of Texas have been hit in the car in which they were riding. We do not know how serious the situation is. We have no information. Mr. Bromley Smith is back here in the Situation Room now. We are getting our information over the tickers. Over. That is affirmative, affirmative. Please keep us advised on here. This plane on which Secretary of State, other cabinet ministers headed for Japan, turning around, returning to Honolulu, will arrive there approximately 2 hours. Over. Do you have anything else, Wayside? No, any other information, get a hold of us as rapidly as possible. All right, the Associated Press is coming out now with a bulletin to the effect that they believe the President was hit in the head. That just came in. Over. The President hit in the head. Over. Roger. We will pass on any additional information we get from here to you. I understand. This is... hold on the line there, Wayside. We have some more information coming up. Wayside. This is Situation Room. I read from the AP bulletin, Kennedy apparently shot in head. He fell face down in back seat of his car. Blood was on his head. Mrs. Kennedy cried, "Oh no," and tried to hold up his head. Connally remained half-seated, slumped to the left. There was blood on his face and forehead. The president and the governor were rushed to Parkland Hospital near the Dallas Trade Mart, where Kennedy was to have made a speech. Over. I read that, over. This is Situation Room. I have nothing further for you now. I will contact you if we get more. Wayside, roger and out.
A few minutes after this call was at 12:45. This was a radio transmission at 12:45 p.m. A few minutes after this, President Kennedy would be declared dead officially to the press at 1:30, and then word went out to the plane carrying half the cabinet over the Pacific, informing them of the condition of the United States government.
Roger, sir. I have Crown on. Would you give him a call, sir?
Crown 972, go ahead. This is Situation Room, relay following to Wayside. We have report quoting Mr. Kilduff in Dallas that the president is dead, that he died about 35 minutes ago. Do you have that, over? The president is dead, is that correct? That is correct. That is correct. New subject. Front office desires plane return Washington with no stop Dallas. Over. That's copied. Wayside copied. All okay. And we return direct to Washington without stopping in Dallas. Roger, roger. All right. This is Situation Room out.
President Johnson faced some monumental decisions after the death of President Kennedy, but the immediate decisions that had to be made were fairly simple. First of all, you turn the plane carrying half the cabinet around, you have them go back to Washington, D.C. You load up Air Force One, you go back to the nation's capital, and you begin governing. And Lyndon Johnson stepped off the plane and asked for help from two key constituencies. One of them, the American people, and the other one was God. And with that, Lyndon Johnson became president for the American people. And at that point, he decided to move forward with the Kennedy legacy and to push forward with the legislative agenda that the Kennedy administration had put in place. As part of this, he began reaching out to world leaders, to political leaders, to family members, to mothers, to wives, and this was the beginning of the Lyndon Johnson era in American politics. David Shreve is going to introduce two clips about Johnson and his drive for economy and his attempt to cut the budget while doing things for people.
Thanks, Kent. And I guess it's a little more than that, in that one of the reviewers of the first three volumes suggested, oddly, in his review at one point, after citing a couple of the conversations about economic policy, concluding that this just suggests that President Johnson was willing to change with the wind. I came across a similar sentiment when I looked through the papers of T. Harry Williams, former LSU professor who, late in his career, set out to write a biography of Lyndon Johnson, and sadly he died in 1979 before he could get the work underway. But I went back and wanted to see if there was anything that he had already formed worth reading, and having admired his work on his Pulitzer Prize winning work on Huey P. Long, I thought that there might be something there. And in this area too, he drew a similar conclusion. He said, perhaps in one of his notes to himself, that the president did not have a coherent or well-formed approach to economic policy or ideology. And I've come to think that nothing could be further from the truth. I chose a couple of these clips because they give you a glimpse of that approach and that ideology. Now, mind you, these are just two conversations out of many. And one of the virtues of this collection is that you don't just see the highlights, and you don't just see the president interacting with one or two people here and there, even chief policymakers in his cabinet or in the Congress. But you see many phases of his mind at work and many different operations simultaneously. And that's true for even one category like economic policy. But what these two conversations show us, I think, is a glimpse of the ways in which he had to deal with policy, the making of economic policy, the kinds of opposition that he faced. In the first one, you'll hear him, in a sense, pleading with Walter Heller, the chairman of his Council of Economic Advisors, to consider him as a New Dealer, a Democrat, a liberal Democrat. And part of the problem he faced, I think, early on was that many in that crowd didn't trust him in that regard, or didn't think that he was faithful enough. And he wants to show Heller, or tell Heller, that he is faithful to this kind of an ideology. And he begins to explain it here. Walter Heller was a Minnesotan, close friend of Hubert Humphrey. He also worked for the Roosevelt administration during World War II in the Department of the Treasury. So he and Johnson had that in common as former New Dealers. But he was chosen by President Kennedy, of course, to be his chairman, first chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Johnson inherits him at this point. And this first conversation comes at a time when Professor Heller is beginning to go on a number of TV shows and undertake a number of interviews with prominent journalists about the Johnson economic policy. So let's listen in.
I say he's been since the day it was first announced. He participated in the formulation of the bill, and he sat in on all the meetings, and he's made speeches all over the country about it, perhaps more than anybody in the administration. He's no Johnny-come-lately to it. Now, why is he cutting these expenses? He's cutting the waste and the things that he need not to in order he has the money to do the things that he does need to do. And he may take out an antiquated installation where they're teaching somebody to fly a plane that'll never be flown, that will need a missile instead, in order to help grandma or somebody in West Virginia or Tennessee that's not eating now.
Right.
Next between an installation and grandma, he's for grandma.
Yeah, that's very good, and of course that follows the theme on that Today Show also, which used that kind of an illustration.
Well, I never agreed that you had to prove you're liberal by showing how much money you could throw away. I have always supported WPA and PWA and river development, and resource development, and full utilization and public housing, and everything else.
Right.
I never supported corruption in any of those things. I never supported waste in any of them, and I never supported throwing away common sense and operating them. I believe in, I'm a kind of a Henry liberal.
Well, and of course, Paul Douglas has done a lot of work to make economy and government respectable. And
that's right. I just point out Harold Ickes and Paul Douglas, some of the greatest liberals we got. Boxmeyer, they don't believe in throwing money away.
Yeah, right.
You don't know whether either one would like to be compared to the other or not, but strange pattern in that regard as far as you're concerned. This is no Johnny-come-lately. On the Naval Affairs Committee in 1938, I was running an investigation pointing up waste in the Navy. In 1948, I was appointed up in the Senate as head of the Preparedness Committee. And I've done this stuff for 12, 15 years in the Senate.
Right.
I've had 25 years pointing up waste, and that's all I'm doing in the federal government. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to have a National Science Foundation. That doesn't mean we're not going to have an Appalachian program. And that doesn't mean that we're not going to have a better program for the Peace Corps. What it does mean is we're going to have less money wasted and more money available for those things because of the stopping the waste.
Right. Well, that's exactly something I want to stress. And
maybe thirsty people want water, but that doesn't mean that you ought to turn on the hydrant and let the tank all run dry before you put a bucket under it. What we're doing is we're going to we're going to put a bucket under it and save all we can.
Right. Can I throw in this connection, of course, there's an awful lot, and especially because of Galbraith's speech, which, by the way, I asked him to send you a copy of. He said he would today.
Very interested in it.
Does that, if they ask about poverty, I think that one can say that we're working on such a program. Now, the question is...
I heard Mr. Galbraith's speech with a great deal of interest, and I've already asked him to send me a copy of it, and expect to be talking to him about it in the next few days. I'm very interested in that program, and I believe in a government for the people.
Right.
PWPUL.
Right. Okay, very good.
You tell Galbraith that I was very excited about the newspaper reports, and I'm surprised he didn't have me a copy autographed over here. But he's my hero, and I want him to get it to me right away.
So I'll do just that.
Right.
Righto. Thank you.
I failed to explain that the first item to which he refers there is the tax cut proposal. And you may have guessed that by reading this. And of course, there's a general reference to his attempt to cut the budget. You find out in this conversation a little bit more about why he mounted such a crusade. There are many reasons for it, some of which you just learned about in this conversation. But admittedly, it becomes clear as you listen to a series of these conversations around this time that part of the effort is designed to be political and cosmetic as well. And one hurdle for the tax cut that had been proposed first in the Kennedy administration and that Johnson had taken up was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Harry Byrd, and you'll see a reference to Mr. Byrd in this conversation. You'll also hear President Johnson make a reference to a man by the name of Tom Girdler. Some of you may remember Tom Girdler, relatively obscure these days, but he was referred to in a famous 1940 speech delivered by FDR, and his name was used as a synonym for enemy of the people. This was the manager of Republic Steel, most responsible for the 1937 Memorial Day massacre. Yet at the same time, this was a guy who later on went to be the general manager of Consolidated Volte Aircraft Corporation during World War II, otherwise known as Convair, and became something of a hero to the American people. So you can read between the lines here, and you can see what President Johnson is saying to Heller in this conversation is when he says we have to please Tom Girdler, that we have to make this program palatable and pleasing to people like that you really probably don't like very much, but are at the same time held in high regard by a great number of Americans. So you get that, and you get a little taste for his approach to passing the tax cut here in this conversation. Again, with Walter Heller, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors.
So I want you to look at that and talk to Treasury. I'm going to have to get my estimates up here, and I don't want to be too low on my estimates on what we're going to do with these receipts if we get a tax bill.
Yeah, well, I think that...
I'd rather be on the high side like every president has from Hoover. I'd rather say they're going to be 94 and have 93 than say they're 92 and have 93.
Right, agreed.
Now, you talk to Treasury and see what your estimates look like, and I want this deficit just as low as I can, and my estimate is the news story. And I don't mind being a little optimistic. Hell, I'm an optimist by nature.
Well,
I don't want to be too much of an exaggerator, but I sure want to be optimistic, and I want to assume that things are going well, and I believe they are, and I believe business is pretty safe in this country, and labor too. And
well, but let me just say...
Incidentally, I don't think they invited you. Did they invite you to the State of the Union thing today?
Yes, they did.
Well, I sure want you to get up some good, sharp, imaginative stuff. Now they tell me poverty's got to go out because y'all haven't got any good program.
Oh, now you got to hear us out on that.
I'm not going to do it unless you got something that'll satisfy Tom Girdler. I want something that stand up.
We're going to discuss it with Ted right now.
Well, what are you going to do? What substance? I don't want any of these boondoggles now.
Well,
that's what they're looking for.
Well, I'm sure they
I'm an
are.
old NYA man, and I had the best record of any administrator in the nation, according to Aubrey Williams. But he fussed with me because I put a little steel in some statewide roadside parks, but I've got 4,600 of them down there now.
That's right.
And they're still lasting, and I got $1 to show for every dollar I spent, and I had 90% of it was labor, and
Right.
10% was material. But somebody's got to find projects of that type. I'm not going to spend it out here now on where it's all going for steel or where it's all just going down the drain and having some...
Well, as a matter of fact, the criticism more than anything else, I think, has been that we haven't put enough of it into brick and mortar. What we're trying to do is put it into people.
That's good. Well, that's what I'm for.
And
But how are you doing it to avoid leaf raking?
Well, we're doing it through the education, health programs, and incidentally, trying to bring the states and localities in it so that they do their share.
That's good. All right, okay. You go and get me a good, solid program that Harry Byrd will look upon with pleasure, and I'll approve it.
Boy, you're setting a tough standard.
Well, there you go. I think I agree wholeheartedly with Joe Califano, who said on a number of occasions that this was about revolution, really. This was about changing the way we ran our economy in a lot of different ways. And this just gives you a little glimpse of how rough that was at the outset. And I think it remained difficult even at the very end of the administration. So you'll perhaps be able to hear in the future other conversations in 1966 and 67 and 68 in a different vein, but about the same general subject. Now, I believe the next selection is going to be a foreign affairs selection, and I think Casey Johnson is going to set those up for us. Casey?
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for inviting me here. In the years following World War II, the Congress's power over foreign affairs, as traditionally exercised through the power to declare war or, in the Senate's case, to approve treaties, by and large declined. But in one area in foreign policy, the new foreign aid program, Congress's power was very much present because foreign aid was an appropriations program. It had to be passed by Congress. There was extensive congressional involvement throughout. Presidents from the inception of the foreign aid program struggled to get foreign aid through an economy-minded Congress. There wasn't a constituency or much of a constituency for foreign aid in the United States. And in the 1950s, presidents began to have a particular problem with this after the House reorganized, created a new subcommittee called the Foreign Operations Subcommittee, and named as the chair of this subcommittee a Louisiana congressman named Otto Passman, a figure who the columnists Evans and Novak dubbed the shrill shopkeeper from Shreveport. Passman was someone who believed in cutting the foreign aid program to the bone and then some, who had extensive knowledge of the program. Was a very, very difficult person to deal with. Dwight Eisenhower in 1957, after Passman was invited to the White House, told his chief of staff to make sure that Passman never again received a White House invitation during Eisenhower's tenure as president. John Kennedy went through two directors of foreign aid. The second, David Bell, had to be arm-twisted to take the position because he said he didn't want to have to deal with Otto Passman on a day-to-day basis. Passman had an unusual habit of calling people in for Friday or Saturday committee hearings, forcing them to return from overseas trips and then canceling the hearings at the last minute. Lyndon Johnson expected that he would be able to deal with Passman more effectively than had his predecessors, partially because of his success in dealing with other conservative Southern Democrats like Harry Byrd, as we sort of got a clip of in the last call. Johnson invited Passman in a high-profile meeting to the White House in December of 1963. He informed the congressman that he would be rigorous in terms of supporting cuts in foreign aid and elimination of waste. Thought that he had a deal worked out with Passman, only to find Passman renege on this deal, push through a dramatic cut in the foreign aid appropriation for 1963, partially by a successful appeal on Passman's part to a number of conservative Texas Democrats whose votes Johnson thought he had commitments from, but it turned out he did not. And this is a conversation, a clip of a short conversation between the president and Texas Congressman Jack Brooks on the night after the House had pushed through the Passman-sponsored cuts.
You want to know honestly how I feel?
Yeah.
I'm really humiliated that I'm president. I got a friendly speaker, and I got a friendly majority leader. I got a friendly Albert Thomas. I got a friendly Jack Brooks, and Otto Passman is king. I think that's disgraceful in this country, because I won't tell you when I see you the next time, confidentially, what we're looking at in the world. And it's a hell of a lot worse than it was last year. And you're giving us $3 billion to deal with, and you gave Kennedy $3.9. And I don't think that's fair, and I don't think it's right, and I think it's awful that a goddamn Cajun from the hills of Louisiana has got more power. Got more power than all of us. I just think that's awful. Yeah. But that's what you got to do, and someday we'll get our way. And if I ever walk up in the cold of night and a rattlesnake's out there and about ready to get him, I ain't going to pull him off. I'll tell you that. Now you remember that.
I want you to remember it. We got some people from...
I remember it. Now you just go and tell all these Texans that want to hit Russia that I want to put those sons of bitches in uniform. Let them go fight the communists for a while. They like to talk a big game, but they don't want to do a damn thing about it.
I'm with you.
Okay.
Good night. Bless your heart.
In addition to appropriations cuts that forced a reorientation of the foreign aid program, the other way that Congress tended to exercise influence using the foreign aid was by attaching policy-related riders, amendments to the foreign aid budget that technically had nothing to do specifically with foreign aid, but affected broader foreign policy concerns. And this was a real problem in the 1963 Foreign Aid Bill, a session that came to be known as the Foreign Aid Revolt, where the Kennedy administration essentially lost control of the legislative situation in the Senate, and a variety of these policy-related amendments got tacked on to the 63 Foreign Aid Bill. Johnson again thought he would be able to manage this more effectively, but on the same day that the House passed the measure that cut the appropriations, it also passed an amendment sponsored by an Illinois Republican congressman named Paul Finley, dealing with a request that had come from the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to increase grain shipments from the United States to the Soviet Union. There was a wheat famine in the Soviet Union in 1963. The Finley Amendment was a demagoguery amendment. It required, if additional shipments of grain were to go to the Soviet Union, that the president had to make a public certification that this shipment served the national interests of the United States. It was an attempt, essentially, to get the Democratic president on record as appearing to be pro-Soviet. Johnson had a quite clear recognition of what Finley's intent was. And in this conversation between Johnson and another Texas Congressman, Albert Thomas, the president is lamenting the political and legislative effects of the passage of this amendment.
Damn idiot now.
No, of course not. But I don't think it's gonna hamstring you a bit on there.
It doesn't hamstring me. It just publicizes that I'm pro-Russian right when Nixon's running against me. That's all it does.
Well, he ain't gonna run because he ain't gonna win.
Well, listen, Albert, you and I are buddies now, and you understand politics, and I do too, and I'm telling you that we're working with the Republicans up there 100%.
Well, I'm on your side.
Well, all right. Well, you just don't ever agree that that's a good clause, because you know goddamn well it ain't. Don't try to shit me, because I know better.
Yes, it's big. Well, I've worked with it in the space.
Yeah, you work with it, but you've been working with it under Republican presidents, not under Democrat. When a Democratic president has to report that he makes a determination that it's in his interest to go with Russia, it's not good when you're running for office. Now, you know that, don't you?
Ultimately, the president succeeded in half on this measure. He got the Finley Amendment excised in the conference committee, although he was not able to restore the appropriations cuts that Passman had pushed through. In foreign policy as a whole, Johnson, by and large, retained the team, at least initially, that he had inherited from President Kennedy, with one important exception, and that was with regards to Latin America. Johnson dismissed both the Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs and the head of Kennedy's Alliance for Progress, consolidated the positions, and then appointed Thomas Mann, who had served as Assistant Secretary of State in the Eisenhower administration, as the new coordinator of Latin American policy for the president. Mann had a reputation as a conservative Democrat, someone who was suspicious of Kennedy's foreign policy, the Alliance for Progress, for what Mann saw as an excessive interest in promoting democracy in Latin America, which he thought was unfeasible. In early January of 1964, Mann and Johnson would face their first foreign policy tests in Latin America after riots broke out in Panama in the Canal Zone, when a group of American high school students, the Zoniacs, violated an agreement worked out between the U.S. and Panama that stated that that high schools in Panama would fly both the American and the Panamanian flags, but not just the American flag. These high school students tore down the Panamanian flag, riots ensued. This seemed like it might resolve itself very quickly as a crisis, but it did not. The Panamanian presidential election was coming up. Panamanians had an incentive to push for a very hard line, and the Panamanian president, Roberto Chiari, called for a renegotiation of the Panama Canal treaties as a precondition to resolving this crisis. And so this is a conversation between Johnson and Georgia Senator Dick Russell, to whom Johnson turned for advice about how to handle the situation in Panama. This is a conversation that occurs just after a call between Johnson and President Chiari that Johnson had initiated, one of the more bizarre calls that I encountered in the tapes. It's a long-distance call. Johnson did not speak Spanish, Chiari did not speak English, and so there were translators, and in the middle of the call it was interrupted by a long-distance operator who ordered Johnson to get off the line because there were other people who needed to use the long-distance line. The call ended with Johnson informing Chiari that he would be sending Thomas Mann down for a visit. And in this conversation, we see Russell attempting to push a strong line in response.
I was cold and hard and tough as hell so far as exactly right. So far as this is concerned, and I went back in and told our group here that I thought we had to remember that a week ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I had to tell them in Bolivia I'd send whatever aid I needed in there to make them release one of our people there. A few days earlier, they had someone else locked up some other place, and I was damn tired of attacking our flag and our embassy and our USIS every time somebody got a little emotional outburst. And they better watch it.
I'm so pleased. Now, that's a great president. That's a man to go down in history.
Now, I just want you to know that, and this group has gone, and Martin will be coming back tomorrow. But the old man finally said, well, he's glad that he's talking to a man that has taken some action. And I said, well, he'll be there, and I think Cy Vance will be pretty tough, too.
Well, that fellow O'Mara down there is a pretty good man.
Well, he's had to order his people to start shooting again.
Yes, well, that's all right. God, if they shoot at them, you can't expect our people to stand there and be killed, not fire back.
Well, I mean, it's not
anywhere in the world.
I'm not trying to unjustify it or justify it. I'm just saying it's hot as a firecracker.
I realize it is.
All right.
I realize it is, but it's wholly a mental state as far as we're concerned, and a national image so far as the United Nations is concerned, and I think we can protect both.
Well, I think the position that ought to be on the Hill is we ought to be careful what we say, but for God's sakes, if we say anything, say we did right and acting promptly to send some the ablest men we got down there. Now, they tell me that everybody in Latin America is scared of this fellow Mann. They highly regard him because he's a tough guy. He's not the regular...
Well, I hope he is. I think he's much tougher than the ones we've had, and he has a velvet glove, but I hope he has his little iron fingers under it.
Well, I think he does. I think he does.
Well, I'm counting on that.
Much to the president's disappointment, what quickly developed in the next 24 hours was that the crisis got worse, but also that the administration itself divided. And a faction within the administration, headed by Attorney General Robert Kennedy and Director of Central Intelligence John McCone, argued that this crisis had been blown out of proportion and that the United States should essentially try to appease it and end the crisis as quickly as possible. And so Johnson returns to Russell the next day in an attempt to sound out Russell about how congressional sentiment might respond to a quick resolution of the crisis. He has a pretty good sense of what Russell is going to recommend as a result of this. This is a conversation that occurs just before an NSC meeting to determine how the administration should respond to Panama.
Why don't we just say that I concur in your recommendation that you inform Cherry that you will not now agree to negotiations, and that you be authorized to say this does not close the door for all time.
No, I wouldn't say make two all the time, but just say that under...
well, that's what he says.
I'd say to agree to negotiations under present conditions, but would not, just does not close the door for all time or forever. That's a hell of a long thing you send him down there. It would confuse me if I were down there with all the pressures that he must feel in that atmosphere down there.
He and Vance had a good talk with the fellow, and both of them were awfully tough with him, and this fellow, every damn one of them running against us for re-election. 600 of them stood outside and said, "Get out of here, gringos."
Yeah, they've been doing that. The one that announces the Colossus of the North, that most vociferously is the one that wins. That's been true the last 3 elections they've had. On the surface, we haven't got a friend there, but if we wasn't there, they wouldn't have anything. They'd be living out there half naked in those swamps.
Johnson does push a tough line on this crisis, and it will be several months before it ultimately is resolved. But this, I think, is a good indication of some of the Latin American policy differences between Kennedy and Johnson. Dick Russell was not an important policy or personal advisor on Latin American policy under Kennedy. In 1964, he would emerge as a key advisor to Johnson. And the last foreign policy-related clip is a conversation between Johnson and Walker Stone, which offers an illustration of one of the striking things about the volumes as a whole, I think, which is how complex a president's day actually was. That this is a president, and this is true for Johnson, for Kennedy and Nixon as well, who had to go through a variety of issues very, very quickly, and so every day would be dealing with 15 or 20 policy issues in these phone calls, in addition to a variety of personal concerns. Foreign aid is on the docket here between the president and Walker Stone. But Stone is speaking also on behalf of old friends of Johnson who are concerned. This is a man who had a heart attack just under a decade before, that he might be working himself a little bit too hard. And Johnson's also very proud of a letter that he's received from a man that all of you know here, J. Frank Dobie, that had come in around 2 weeks after he had acceded to power, a glowing letter saying that Johnson had successfully handled the transition, that Johnson carried around with him for several weeks in his pocket and would flip it out at a moment's notice and read from it. So this is a conversation between Johnson and an old friend discussing events in early January of 1964.
All right, will you listen for just a minute? My God, now you asked for it, I'll tell you.
But I want it.
You're outpacing. You're racing your motor. You goddamn it. You've got this thing. You've got this thing in the bag.
I'm just enjoying my friend.
They can't possibly beat you. But I'll tell you what you're doing. You are trying to do too much.
No, I'm not. I'm not. You know, all I've done, I worked on the budget, and
Now you promised to listen to me, old Dobie.
Well, I'm like rolling out. At least like he said he was. Go ahead.
You're trying to do too much, and you're racing your motor, and you're drinking too much, and you're not sleeping enough.
Oh, now listen now, my friend. Oh, that's wrong. I'll tell you what I'm doing. I had a quiet morning. I didn't come to the office until I waked up at 6:30. All my life, I waked up on a road gang, and I can't get that. But you get up early, don't you? You had to get through Oklahoma. You can't tell me you ever made the big leagues not getting up early. It takes us a little longer than does some other folks. And I get up early, and I read all the papers. I read about 15 of them. But I read them in bed, and I'm relaxed, drink my tea, and go to the bathroom and watch the television. And then this morning, I won't tell you, this stuff's got around town, and my friend's really worried, and I won't tell you why. I never enjoyed life more, never felt better in my life physically than I do now. At 12:45 today, I took Jack Valenti, Walter Jenkins, Bill Moyer, and I swam the length of that pool 8 times. 8 times today. I went down and had a hamburger. I came back and looked over my State of the Union, called up, fussed at the fellow about $40 million, too much in the budget, and stretched out, took a little doze, lost consciousness for about 5 minutes on the couch, came back, and they said, now, are you in a good humor? I said, yeah. Well, I said, we'll save you this until you're in a bad humor. And I said, what is it? Said, it's George Carmack's article. Said, we won't give it to you when you're in a bad humor. So I knew it was going to be bad if it's George's. And I read it, and he said that they always say that folks are not true to their raising. But Johnson is true to his raising. And he wrote the kindest, sweetest, nicest description. I'm going to send it to Dean Rusk, Mike George Bundy, and all these sophisticated fellows. Andrew Biddle-Duke, keep compliments, Andrew Biddle-Duke. And I want you to read it. And I'll get it. Then I read old man Dobie's letter, and the funny thing was, Houston Hart wrote about it like George Carmack did for all of his papers. North American Newspaper Alliance used it. But he said if there's ever a place where Andrew Biddle-Duke, the proper chief of protocol, was not needed, it was Stonewall, Texas. So I thought you would pay. So I'm going over, I'm going to bed early. You know, I don't have anything to do at night. I can't go out. If I broke out twice. What I do is I go home and I have myself 2 or 3 highballs with my wife, and I have to sit there and read and work. I've got Indonesia. They wanted me to give them $35 million the other day, and I had to read on it till 2 o'clock in the morning. They came in and I had to have India 65, and I read on it till 2 and turned both up down. But I just thought, what if I hadn't had the desire to read them? I'd be in a hell of a shape.
Now we'll be listening to some conversations about Johnson and Texas life with Kent.
KC. Now that we've seen Lyndon Johnson, A Day in the Life of Lyndon Johnson, these in some ways are sort of America's first reality show. We have 800 hours of it. So if you can get this on ABC, this will be endless entertainment for the kids. These volumes are hopefully rich resources for scholars. And there are a lot of issues that Lyndon Johnson as president deals with in his first 71 days, which are covered in these since November 22nd through the end of January. The war on poverty, the budget, foreign aid, crises in Panama, in Cyprus, where there's almost a civil war. There's a coup in Vietnam. There's constant turmoil in Africa. A number of new governments arise in coup d'etat in Africa. Lyndon Johnson is dealing with each of these, as KC has said, on a daily basis and has to deflect and attract issues as he goes along during the day. In the interim, in the middle part of this volume is Christmas. And Lyndon Johnson and his family went home to Texas, not far from where we're sitting now. And there are some very rich conversations about what it's like to live in Texas. And I think for people who like to study Texas and study what it was like to be a prominent person in Texas, some people think Lyndon Johnson's now a legend. I'll let you decide whether you think of that. He was certainly maybe the most legendary talker in American history. I'll have some arguments about that from historians and other people. But what he has left us is 800 hours of a legend talking. And what passes through the microphone was Lyndon Johnson dealing with the 1960s and dealing with the many currents that came across the desk of the American president. But on New Year's Day, 1964, Lyndon Johnson was less a president, still dealing with issues, but less a president and more of a family man, and one who was touching base with his old friends and saying hello to people who were dear to him. And I want to play a quick couple of clips here. This first one, we don't have time to play here, but Johnson is talking to Richard Russell about a time that Russell came in apparently inebriated from a football game. And they said they put a little brass plaque on the chair and called it Dick Russell's chair the night he came in with Herman Brown from the football game. And as Johnson would do in these conversations, handed the phone over to his wife, Lady Bird Johnson. And here is an exchange between Mrs. Johnson, the First Lady, and Senator Richard Russell. And by the way, the backdrop, I don't know how many of y'all follow University of Texas Longhorn football. I suspect there might be a few out there. As I grew up in Texas, but I grew up, and I'm going to say it very quietly, a Texas A&M fan. And I'm heading out the back when this is over. University of Texas won the national championship in collegiate football that year, and they beat Navy in the Cotton Bowl on January the 1st, 1964. Many of you might remember Navy's quarterback, a little fella named Roger Staubach. University of Texas won that game 24-6, and all of the calls that day to the Johnson Ranch were glowing about Longhorn football. And some of this comes up in this clip and in the next one.
I hope you have a wonderful new year. And wait a minute, A.W. wants to speak on behalf of me and Wesley and a few of them here and say hi to you after this girl talks to you.
All right, sir.
Senator?
Honey, how are you?
Oh, I'm fine.
Seeing you with great approval in the newsreel and in the paper.
There's nobody's approval that I want more than yours.
Oh, Lord, what a politician. No wonder Lyndon Johnson's president.
And listen,
He's president.
well, all my love to you.
Daughters of yours at home, or where are they this Christmas?
Well, they were together with us at Christmas, and we had all of Lyndon's family at Christmas, and now we're having my family, about 15 Taylors, but my 2 children went with their dates to watch the big ball game.
That was a terrific ball game. That Texas could beat any college team in the world today. I never saw a team play like they did.
and they'll be back tomorrow. And I want that Linda Bird's going to come back up there. And the main reason she's coming is because she wants to listen to smart people like you and get smarter.
She needs to be up there to help her daddy. She's a politician just like her mother.
and here's Judge Morrison.
As Professor Naftali mentioned before, I spent much of my formative childhood in rural Texas. And as you do in rural Texas, you hear a lot of stories. And you get used to listening to people talk. And this next conversation was about something that also might be dear to some people here. It's about deer hunting, particularly down at the LBJ Ranch, between A.W. Judge Morrison, a close friend of the Johnson family, and again, Richard Russell. This is a very long conversation with Richard Russell, and we've split it up here in a couple of places. But this, I could very well be sitting at the general store in Trinidad, Texas, hearing people talk about things this way, but this is a little slice of life at the Johnson Ranch. There might be a little bit of bragging here.
And here's Judge Morrison.
Senator?
Judge, how are you?
All right, Happy New Year to you.
Same to you, eh? Happy and many of them. I get along just fine. Yeah, London reminded me that time I saw they disgraced themselves over there and you had to take care of them.
Oh, heck, he shouldn't have mentioned that. He just kidding.
Well, that's all.
How'd you like old Texas today?
I don't tell you, they could have whipped any college football team there was assembled today.
They're working today, weren't they?
Navy had a good team, but they just looked like a high school out there trying to play Texas. Yeah. They had a good team. I don't tell you that number 7 for Texas was the most terrific tackle I ever saw in the line. He was killing 3 men out.
Yeah, he's tough. He sure is.
And he's not such a hell of a big fella either.
No, he just determined.
But he got the speed and quick as a cat, too.
How you feeling?
I'm feeling fine, I hope you are.
Well, you had nice holidays?
Yeah, we've had a good time.
Well, that's sure
Kill
fun.
any day out there?
Yeah, we did. We miss you.
Well, I wish I could have been there. I hope the president didn't miss it many times he did that time he created that shortage of...
No, he made an awful good shot yesterday. He shot a deer, I think, about 350 yards right through the neck.
Well, that's wonderful.
He really did. You know, I'm not lying about that one.
Well, that's all right. Nobody ever killed one as far as I put that in his home shot, Joe.
Oh, I know it. Well,
look so serious and knit those eyebrows and I tell about it.
It sure is good to hear you sound so well.
Well, it's good to hear from you. I've done a happy new year to you and many of them.
So if, the moral of the story is if you're at the Johnson Ranch, stay at least 351 yards away from President Johnson, unless you have some tobacco and you're feeding clearance. The last clip that we want to end with today is back more on the scholarly scene. In 1964, 1965, The Democratic Party was at the height of its power in post-World War II America. It was the election in the late 1964 that would provide the strong electoral base and constituent base for the passage of much of the Great Society. And it was Lyndon Johnson molding and shaping the constituencies that provided a good portion of that power. Well, at the end of January 1964, Lyndon Johnson is putting together a message that would guide his campaign for the upcoming 1964 election. He had a conversation with Hubert Humphrey, who we all know eventually would become the vice presidential running mate and eventually vice president. At this time, he was the Senate Minority Whip. Johnson had heard him make a statement about the Democratic Party earlier in the day and thought it was fantastic. So he picked up the phone, as he would do, and called him up to thank him and say, that's great, but not to stop there, to say, okay, you've got the message out. Now I want you to get all the other Democrats to get the message out, and I want you to get on television, and I want you to call the newspapers, and I want you to make sure that the American people know that this isn't just one thing you're saying. We're going to keep pushing this forward. Well, this is the height of liberalism in post-war America, and Lyndon Johnson lays out what he thinks first is good about the Democratic Party, but also what he thinks is bad about the Republican Party. Ironically, on the other side of the world at this time, a coup in South Vietnam is beginning to be set in motion, which would undo a coup that had occurred just prior to the Kennedy assassination. And at this moment, in late January 1964, which is where these volumes end, we have Lyndon Johnson expressing what's really the bedrock part of the Democratic Party's strength. And yet on the other side of the world, the complications in Vietnam would continue to fester. Before I play this, let me cover a few things that he'll talk about here. Roosevelt's boy Jimmy, there were some questionable financial transactions, some financial dealings. That's what he's talking about. The dog Fala, there was a story that Franklin Roosevelt turned around an American destroyer to go back to Alaska to pick up his little puppy, which was not a good use of American money. The Margaret Truman and Harry Truman bit here. Harry Truman reacted strongly to a music critic's assessment of his daughter's singing voice and wrote a letter to this man with the last name of Hume and said that if he ever saw him, that he would need a beefsteak for his eye and a supporter below. He later, when remembering what he wrote, had some different words that he chose. But those are a couple of things that I think will be helpful to get an understanding of what's going on here.
So I'll just say, well, the reason the Republicans haven't won any elections except Eisenhower, and Eisenhower didn't mess around to this trash. He was a national hero. But the reason they haven't won since Hoover is because they spent all the time on Roosevelt's boy, Jimmy, and on his dog. Yeah. And they spent all their time on Truman and Margaret and the music critics. And they spent all their time on Kennedy and his religion and other things. And they just haven't won one. And if they don't stand for something, hell, if they just come out here and talk about revival of the corn tassel, or come out for Tom Watson watermelons, it'd be something. But they just, by God, against things, against everything, and trying to smear and fear. And that you have no alternative. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch man asked me today, said, what Republican frightens you the most? I said, well, not any of them now. When one of them comes out and said, this is what I stand for, and gives me a foreign policy and said, here's what I'm for. And then he gives me a domestic policy and said, here's what I'm for. Here's what I'm for in the field of education, in the field of manpower, in the field of training, in the field of civil rights. Then I'll get scared, because even if it's different from mine, they'll have a choice. But now they haven't any choice, because we're the only ones to stand for anything. They're just against things. Yes, I say, now, damn it, boys, you get here and get your speech and ask some questions here and get your name in the paper here, and every damn one of them ought to take your line. And what we are, we're for war on poverty. We're for economic growth. We're for world peace. We're for security. We're for Medicare. We're for human dignity. We're for human rights. Now, this is what we stand for. A government of strength, a government that's solvent, and a government that's compassionate. And it just makes these guys look silly.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I just want to congratulate you. I was reading it. It's the best thing I'd seen all day. God damn it, I had Indonesia, and I had Panama, and I had Cyprus, and they're coming in tonight, 7:30. The British trying to shove us in there overnight. And I guess we got to go, but I'm trying my damnedest to get the Turks to agree not to invade so we can hold off for another day or two.
I hope so. Well, I just got back here after we'd had that little visit over there. These press boys were all waiting up here to see me, so I just...
Well, you just ought to hit it tomorrow. Just every day you ought to say the Democratic Party is the one party left for America because the other fellows don't stand for anything.
That's right.
I just, God pity them, for they know not what to do. I just feel sorry for them because what do they stand for?
Well, we're often, it takes a lot of patience to transcribe, but when you're transcribing someone as colorful and interesting as Johnson, it makes it all worthwhile. This is the first time that all of Johnson's tapes are being transcribed. Michael Beschloss has done a wonderful job of giving some of the greatest hits to you, but his work just covers 7% of all the conversations. For the first volume, his volume, to cover that period, we're producing 11. And the next 3 volumes of our series will be available a year from now. We try to put as much as we can on the web, and eventually all of this will be on the web so that anybody, anywhere in this country or around the world can download these tapes and transcripts. Because we feel that this is the finest way to teach people about civics and citizenship. There is no better way to understand the difficulties and obligations of being the American president than sitting with Lyndon Johnson as he tries to make this a better world. We're very grateful that you came tonight. And I want to again thank Harry Middleton for making this trove possible with the help of the Johnson family. I hope we're doing a good job and we could use your help, and we hope that this material will be used. And I think Johnson, I hope I can say that Lyndon Johnson would be pleased if that were the case.
Yes, there's time. We have time for just a very few questions, if you have any. There are microphones in both aisles, so if you do have a question, please step up to the mic. And if you are going to address it to a particular person, tell us who that person is.
Yes, just to all of you up there. It seems like with that last clip, this is a good time to ask this question. Things seem to have turned. Apparently, the Democratic Party doesn't have a message today. I've been hearing that a lot from the media and various sources. They do not have a message. What do you think the message should be?
The Miller Center, I should say, is officially a nonpartisan organization.
We are historians.
Maybe if we can channel Lyndon Johnson's spirit and energy back, it'd enliven American politics. Is that safe to say?
Well, look, the point is that parties that have a positive message deserve to win.
What I tell my students is the party that controls those 3 issues of strength, solvency, and compassion often can control the middle ground of American politics, and I think that's really part of the key.
Question over here.
I applaud more than ever the decision for the early release of the tapes, and I certainly feel that understanding of politics and how nations and decisions are made are enormously facilitated by what is taking place tonight. I ask a question. There are other presidential libraries, and I'm sure there are a lot of tapes. What's the possibility of the early release of some of the information contained in various presidential libraries that have followed Lyndon Johnson's? Thank you.
We are trying to transcribe as much of the 5,000 hours of presidential tapes as we can. The very first presidential tape was Franklin Roosevelt. The Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower tapes are all fully available. The Kennedy tapes are about 65 to 70% available. The Johnson Library deserves enormous credit for having moved faster in the declassification of its tapes than any other presidential library. There are still quite a few Nixon tapes to be released, but the National Archives system, which faces budget constraints, as does all of the government, is doing its very best to release the presidential tapes in chronological order as quickly as possible. Frankly, we haven't caught up with all the tapes that the LBJ Library has released thus far. So we want more tapes released. The American people deserve it, but it's going to take a while to transcribe them.
Larry Wright.
Did I understand one of you to say that there was 800 hours of tape in total? Was that?
That's correct.
That just doesn't seem like very many hours of tape. And presidency spanned such a long period of time, and there were, if I understand it right, there were tapes on the phones in the White House, at home in Texas. There were room tapes, and so it seems like there should be more tape. Am I wrong about that? 800 hours is a great treasure trove, but it seems like there would be thousands.
That's all there were.
And with Johnson, too, he was unique in one regard with respect to taping. And Tim, of course, just mentioned the other presidents who have recordings. He was really the only one to use the tapes. It was a managerial tool. And so what I think you have is we're fortunate in that early in the administration, he had, for whatever reason, the wherewithal to tape record, and in some cases to have White House secretaries transcribe some of these recordings as well. But as time wore on, I think things just got a little too hectic, and to make that a high priority, so that the number of tapes does drop off dramatically. That may in part explain why we only have 800 instead of 1,500 or 2,000 hours, which if he had gone at the same clip as he had throughout 1964, that's what you would have. You would have that much.
There is a phenomenal archive that will be shared with us in a few years. In 1968, and you know how difficult a year that was for President Johnson, he decided to tape meetings in addition to taping telephone conversations. And I understand there are about 120 hours of meeting conversations that the library will get to once it completes all the telephone tapes. Those tapes should, I think, better than any record that we have today, reveal, and it'll be difficult, I'm sure, but the agony, the difficulties for President Johnson in that year of 1968, and it will be an irreplaceable record about the burdens of being president. That's a few years off, I believe.
Okay, I think I want to repeat the director's invitation to come up to the second floor for a champagne reception. I have enjoyed this last time with all of you very much, and I'll look forward to seeing you up there, second floor. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Harry. How'd you like the clips? How did you like them?
Oh, they're wonderful. Yeah, they're great. Great.
Well done, Casey.
I thought he knew about that. So that's.
The Presidential Recordings is published by W.W. Norton and Company. For more information, visit www.norton.com.